All right. So what we've been talking about before your break was the different schools of thought within psychology itself. And we've been talking about some of the traditional schools. And there's two schools of thoughts that can't really be tied to certain individuals or certain founders. And those two fields are social psychology and developmental psychology. Okay? Social psychology is kind of the study of how individuals, how one social system influences the individual's behavior and how the individual influences their social world. Okay, and like I said in the introduction to the class, this can include anywhere from societies and cultures to intimate relationships or mother-parent mother-child relationships, and anything of the like. And there's two kind of things that kind of philosophical things that come out of social psychology, and that is situationalism and subjective experience. Okay, what's going to come out of the majority of the social psychological research is that we can't say a person behaves the way they do because there is something dispositional about that person that makes them do what they do. Okay, meaning a lot of psychological theories such as behaviorism, humanistic theory, Freud's theory, they explain criminal behavior, altruistic behavior, all of those behaviors on the very individual level. That it's all because of the individual that a person is successful, unsuccessful, poor or rich, is a good person or a bad person. Okay? And this has really largely influenced our ideas of society. Okay? So if we look at the United States right now, one robust political opinion about people who are in poverty and homeless is that the individual is lazy. Okay? And we see this, in a lot of political rhetoric and whatnot, that if a person was not lazy, they would not be unemployed or homeless. Okay? That's a dispositional explanation of poverty and homelessness. Okay? When we see a mass shooting, the instant response is that person must have a mental illness which caused that person to commit that crime. Okay? The problem with that is the majority of people who kill other people don't have a mental illness. Okay? I want you to think about this because a lot of times shooting and murdering are blamed on depression. Has anybody in here really had depression? Okay, if you have depression, you don't want to plan. You don't even have the motivation to even think about what it would take to kill someone. Killing someone is the last thing on a depressed person's mind. Okay, let alone coming up with the physical energy to do it. Okay, but the first thing we do when we see a mass shooting or a crime like that is we want to go, what's wrong with that person? Okay, social psychology thinks of it differently. Instead of saying, what's wrong with the person, we sit here and we go, what's wrong with the situation? Okay, and we see human behavior acting like an actor on a stage. In order to understand the plot of a play, you have to understand the actors that are interacting with each other. You have to understand the stage. You have to understand the script. You have to understand the audience. Okay? You have to understand all of these variables and all of these situations. You have to understand the whole stage in order to understand the plot of the play. And in psychology, we believe that is the same with human behavior. You cannot just look at the actor. You have to look at everything that's acting on the actor. Okay? And so it's a little bit different thought. And when we get to later on in the social world, in social psychology, we'll talk about what makes everyday, ordinary people do acts of unimaginable pain and harm, such as shocking someone to 450 volts. Or why is it that most domestic homicides are caused by someone who is not intoxicated and is sober and clear-minded at the time? In fact, more than 60% of domestic homicides are committed by that individual. Okay? And we have to look beyond the individual to discover that. Okay? And we also, in social psychology, believe that not only do we need to look at things objectively, we have to understand the subjective experience of individuals. Meaning that if I want to understand the experience of my students, yeah, I could do surveys. I could sit here and objectively measure how many, on a scale of 1 to 5, what did you think of the class? But honestly, if I really wanted to understand it, I need to sit down with you and ask how you experienced it. Not how you think you experienced it in relation to everybody else. Okay? And that's a little bit of a different flavor in psychology because we think most of the time that one model fits all. And the only model that matters is the objective model. Okay? But psychology really brings up the idea of subjective experience, and that's why when we get to that section, we'll talk a lot about attitudes and attitude formation and those types of subjects. Okay? The next field that really can't be narrowed down to just a couple people is developmental psychology. Okay? Now, Elsa told me that you guys talk about this all the time in your professional development stuff, but there's different theorists about different developmental stage theories, all that kind of stuff. But again, the unique thing about developmental psychology is that what it's looking at is how we change over time. Okay, that we're not just these static individuals. And the good news is unlike traditional ideas, we even continue to grow after the age of 18. That's good news for all of us, I think. Okay? All right? So those are two fields that don't have a specific individual, but have their own different ways of thinking about human behavior and mental processes. Okay? And then the last two kind of approaches to studying human behavior and kind of a camp type setting is one is the cognitive approach. Now, in the 1960s, we had something called the cognitive revolution, and it was a response to the behaviorists ignoring mental processes. And they said it's vital to understand mental processes in order to understand behavior. Okay? And so those games I showed you, those techniques about which category you would pick or which door would you go under, those all came out of the cognitive revolution and trying to understand how we process information. Okay? And when we get to this section, we'll talk a lot about how we have two systems of cognition. We have a slow, laborious one, the one that when you read something, you really have to focus and you have to concentrate on it. And then we have this very fast, reactive one. Okay? The fast, reactive one is the one that allows us to get in our car, turn it on without even thinking about it. Okay? The slow, laborious one is the one you have to when you're engaging in deep thought or deep study. Okay? We don't like engaging in the slow, laborious one because it's energy depriving. Okay? And we will, when we can, always divert to that quick thinking system. Okay? But we'll talk about how those two systems interact to produce thoughts and thinking and how they influence things like memory. Okay? And so, but that's another thought in that we have to take thinking into account to understand behavior and mental processes. And then the last one really came out when we started having new technologies such as MRI scans, EEGs, and that is the biological and neuroscience studies. This is where what we want to do is look into the brain and the nervous system of an individual and determine the associated behavioral or mental process that goes along with it. Okay, and so we'll talk more about that because that's the structure that we often talk about. Okay, and so those are all the camps that we have in psychology, or most of them. Okay, in a general sense. Today, when a psychologist is sitting down analyzing data or trying to help someone out, I'm actually going to skip to this slide right here, is that most psychologists today study behavior in what we call the biopsychosocial model of behavior. Okay? An example of this is my dissertation. My dissertation was on social identity and loneliness, okay, which is an emotional and a social process. But my dissertation did not pass until I wrote about the associated brain regions to loneliness and identity. Okay? So when I wrote mine, even though I was only trying to focus on the psychological and social processes of human behavior, I had to include the biological processes. Okay? And that tends to be how we analyze behavior and mental processes today, and you'll see most research papers will focus on the psychology, which is emotions and thoughts. Social, which is the interaction between individuals, and the biological, which is the associated neural processes that go along with that behavior or mental process. Okay? All right. So we've talked about the goals of psychology, and we defined it. We talked about overarching philosophical questions that many of the sciences, including psychology, are still trying to answer. And we looked at different camps of thought that influence the way psychologists think about behavior and mental processes. And again, we have so many because we're still a very young science. And hopefully as time goes by, we'll condense those. Okay. What I'd like to kind of conclude with is kind of give you what psychologists do, what it takes to become one, and the different aspects of a psychologist. Okay. So a psychologist is usually a master's or doctor trained person. And the thing that we're most trained on is methods. So when I was getting my master's and doctorate, it was about 70% statistics and research methodology. Okay? And then it was about 30% theory and knowledge. Okay? But the major thing we're trained on is how to do the work of psychology. Okay? As I said at the beginning of the class, about 51% of psychologists are what we call clinical psychologists. These are people who are usually doctorally trained to treat severe psychological problems, and they also do research on psychological problems. Okay. We also have counseling psychologists. And then we have the counterpart, which are psychiatrists. Psychologists are PhD or psychology doctorates. They're trained in method, assessment, and treatment. Okay? And then there are medically trained psychiatrists. A psychiatrist is someone who has a medical degree and then they specialized in psychiatry. And what they're trained in is medication and some of them are trained on surgery. But if you want to think about it this way, psychologists, assessment, and psychological treatment, psychiatrists, medication. That's truly the difference. One's PhD, one's MD. Okay? But those are the people who do treatment for psychological disorders and whatnot. Again, they make up about 51% of the field. But we also have several other types of psychologists. For example, I'm a social psychologist. We also have experimental psychologists who just do pure theory research. Okay? We have media, neuroscience, personality psychologists. And to kind of give you an example of the different flavors of psychology, at the beginning of the class, I started to mention industrial organizational psychologists. Okay? And